So thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I cannot guarantee that you're going to like the invitation, but I can guarantee that it's going to be very different from what you usually hear. It's not... I'll use as much time as needed. So, today, societies are what we call, and what Ulrich Beck, a famous sociologist, said, are risk societies. And what does that mean? It means that people and the society in general is increasingly occupied with debating, preventing, and managing risks that mostly by itself, the society itself, has produced. And one characteristic example is smoking, because an unfortunate invention and modernization industrial development was the development of the automatic rolling cigarette machine that created all this trend of smoking tobacco cigarettes instead of using tobacco in other forms that was mainly happening in the past. So that was industrial and probably scientific progress that created problems and risks in society. Now, how do we manage and how do we address this risk coming from smoking? Well, of course, as with every other risk, in science we trust, but should we? There are two terms that look similar, but they are very, very different. One is trust and one is faith. Faith is blindly believing, irrespective of the presence or absence of any evidence supporting or contradicting what we believe. It is belief based mainly on emotion and by submitting intellectual humility. So it is typical for religion. This is faith. Trust, on the other hand, is observation based. It depends on evidence and it can be earned or lost, but you cannot take it for granted. So scrutiny is very important in order to generate trust. It is irrational and self-destructive to trust without scrutiny, and it would stifle someone's intellectual development to immediately dismiss everything other people say as irrelevant to facts, based on faith, based on prejudice, based on ideology, which is more relevant to faith than to trust. And one of the famous motto of the Royal College of the Royal Society of Royal College of Science in the UK is take nobody's word for it. It means you will always question knowledge, you will always question facts. So tobacco control is one such risk management and risk regulation instrument or industry. It's not only science because it's also politics in today's risk society. And of course, it addresses smoking, or it is supposed to address smoking. It's questionable whether they address smoking or tobacco use in general, and there are some tobacco products which are almost harmless, like snus, or even nicotine use in general. It's debatable whether we're having tobacco control, an anti-smoking war, or an anti-nicotine war. And are we discussing in public health about health effects, that is disease and death caused by smoking, or the morality of using nicotine by people? And there are various organizations, mainly scientific, but also scientific and political at the same time, who participate in this whole consortium of tobacco control. For example, the WHO, the CDC, the FDA, the European Commission, of course, which participates in various of these groups. And they have to use science to identify, examine, analyze, quantify, and of course, manage and resolve risks coming from smoking. Now, the science of identifying and quantifying risk, I think it has been resolved to the most extent, and for many years. The knowledge about the harmful effects of smoking was first officially reported back in the 60s, in 1962 by the Royal College of Physicians and in 1964 by the Surgeon General in the US. So we have 60 years, more than 60 years of extensive knowledge about the adverse effects of smoking. But the problem is how will we address, or how are we addressing and resolving this problem? We're not doing a very good job, because after all these 60 years, we still have more than 1 billion smokers in the world. And the rate of smoking, the proportion of the population smoking may be going down, but the absolute number of smokers is stable or even going up because of the increase in the overall population. And there should be some scrutiny about the outcome because the outcome is not particularly successful until now. Now, the interaction between tobacco control and tobacco harm reduction is, I would say, problematic in one word. It is mixed, mostly confusing. The FCTC, for example, mentions in one of the major articles that harm reduction is part of the solution and is a way of addressing the problems of smoking, but there is no real application of harm reduction within the WHO and the FCTC. In fact, it has been largely unacceptable by the tobacco control movement. Of course, there are exceptions, but as a general stance and the general approach by the WHO, harm reduction is unacceptable. But harm reduction, which of course does not only involve smoking, but it's a whole ideology, a whole strategy, and a whole approach for many things, even in our daily lives, it's not only about reducing the harm from substance use, any substance use, but it is also about addressing stigma, addressing marginalization, criminalization, inequalities, oppression, as well as supporting the liberty of someone to make informed personal choices and decisions. That's what harm reduction is all about. And let's not forget that if we look at the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion in 1986 by the WHO, we should conclude that harm reduction, tobacco harm reduction, is a human rights issue, because the WHO said that people cannot achieve their fullest health potential unless they are able to take control of things that determine their health, and that we need to provide the necessary access to information and to the tools, we can also say products, to help them promote their health. And I think that with smoking, the WHO is not doing a very good job supporting their own Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion. And tobacco harm reduction has been suggested as a long-term non-medical practice of addressing smoking for a long time. It was in 1991, so 30 years ago, that the father of tobacco harm reduction, Michael Russell, Professor Michael Russell, said that there should be some long-term alternatives to tobacco that could make the virtual elimination of smoking a reality. And he was talking at that time mostly about smokeless tobacco products, because none of these recent products like heated tobacco and electronic cigarettes were invented at that time. And he was talking about nicotine replacement in any form that would be made palatable and acceptable, so smokers should want to use them, otherwise all these products would be useless. And he suggested that this should be used not as a medical intervention, but on a consumer basis, to be used by smokers, these products, as consumer products. And he suggested that the health authority should endorse and create competitive advantages for these products through tax advances and several other measures. But what has happened today, after 30 years since that statement, that publication by Michael Russell? Well, I would say unexpectedly, but also unreasonably, there is a growing, overwhelming, largely authoritarian and restrictive prohibitory approach, up to the point of even equating tobacco cigarettes with all these harm reduction products, which makes zero sense, not even in scientific terms, but also using simple common sense, even for non-experts. This violates the principle of risk proportionate regulation, and we've seen countries where the paradox of allowing legally the sales of the most lethal form of nicotine intake, these products are legally available, and they are banning the least harmful nicotine-containing products. That makes zero sense from a regulatory standpoint. I think that most of the tobacco control community have a clear prohibitory agenda, not for smoking, for nicotine. That's very important. And they base this on an approach of risk aversion and supposed risk elimination. You know, in the perfect society, we would have no crime, no drug use, no disease, no death, no thieves, nothing. But we don't live in an ideal society. We need to be realistic. And this approach of forgetting basically about realism and being idealistic is causing public health harm. So is this approach really science, and does it serve the purpose of properly communicating scientific facts and truth to the society, not only to smokers, to everyone? Well, let's see some examples. First of all, we did a study among healthcare professionals in Greece in 2016, and we found that the vast majority of healthcare professionals, doctors, physicians, and nurses, said that the contribution of nicotine to smoking-related atherosclerosis, but not only atherosclerosis, lung disease, and cancer, the contribution of nicotine was extremely very important or important. A huge proportion. Wrong, completely. What about non-experts? In a study in 2017, in a representative to the population group of more than 4,000 citizens of the Attica prefecture, here around Athens, it was only 4.6% of participants who reported that electronic cigarettes were substantially less harmful, which is the correct response to the question, than tobacco cigarettes. And there were more than almost 40% who said that they are equally or even more harmful than tobacco cigarettes. Makes zero sense. So we're doing something wrong. We're not communicating the right message. The problematic stance of tobacco control is that it's mainly dogmatic, idealistic, it's based on ideology. It continuously then tries to find evidence to support their ideology. So it's the exact opposite of what we're doing in science. In science, we generate data and evidence, and then we make conclusions and recommendations. In an important part of the tobacco control movement, they do the exact opposite. They make decisions and recommendations, and then they try to find evidence to support their own predetermined conclusions. And that's why they continuously cherry pick and frequently misinterpret evidence. And of course, they attempt to suppress any kind of criticism. And their efforts include ad hominem attacks, even against Michael Russell, the father of harm reduction, against respectable organizations. I have witnessed myself such an attack against Public Health England in a medical conference, not in a private discussion, for, in some cases, real, in most cases, imaginative conflicts, without even discussing about content of research or the quality and the evidence that someone is using to support his opinion, which may be different from the status quo of the tobacco control. They don't even discuss about evidence at all. And of course, they engage into a fear-mongering campaign based on an extreme application of the precautionary principle, which I will present later. They emphasize potentially and theoretically devastating future risks without looking at what is common knowledge today. And it has always been in science that we make decisions and recommendations based on currently available evidence. Examples of this include, and I just used one, there are many, the famous EVALI case in the US. EVALI means e-cigarette or vaping-associated lung injury. As harm, an acute lung injury that was not caused by e-cigarettes. It was caused by illicit marijuana products. The CDC and the FDA have accepted that they were caused by illicit marijuana products, but still they named it after e-cigarettes. They wanted to make sure that people will believe that it's because of e-cigarettes, so they added the term vaping, so e-cigarette or vaping, and despite acknowledging that it was not due to nicotine e-cigarettes, but it was due to illicit marijuana oils, they never changed the name. Another characteristic example is the vaping epidemic in the US. It has been presented as a complete disaster. I don't know if some people may even think that they're going to see adolescents falling on the streets and dying in front of them because of vaping. That's how dramatic the presentation of the vaping epidemic was. Every day, at least until 2021, you could see articles and reports in big newspapers and news media about the vaping epidemic and the new disaster. And when you look at the evidence, you see that from 2011 to 2019, that electronic cigarettes became popular in the US, the smoking rates went down at an unprecedented rate, much accelerated compared to the previous period. And of course, when you look at e-cigarette use among non-smoking use, it was absolutely minimal. Frequent use was less than 1% even in 2018. And then if you look over time, what is happening even with vaping, you see that vaping has reduced dramatically over time. So it was not a trend that was here to stay. It didn't result in long-term sustained use. Instead, it went down pretty rapidly. But what's the damage to the smokers who now think that e-cigarettes are causing harm to people and result in an epidemic in adolescents? Now, all this position is based on the precautionary, the so-called better safe than sorry principle. But the precautionary principle is particularly problematic for several reasons. First of all, there is no objectivity in the precautionary principle. There is no structured procedure, and that's why decision-making is distorted. It's pretty subjective. It is based on emotions. It is based on public perceptions and pressures. They try to create the public perceptions that they want. These perceptions may be popular, but they are largely unreliable. They also distract from greater threats. They take precautionary measures for the least harmful product, but they allow legally the sales of the most harmful product. I think that these are, in general, the problems of the precautionary principle, but for harm reduction in smoking, I think they are pretty much applicable. It doesn't matter how speculative or theoretical these concerns are. They try to draw attention away from the comparative assessment of risks and costs, and that's why we're losing balance when we make decisions. It is vague and largely unclear, so depending on someone's ideology or predetermined decisions, he can use the precautionary principle by being extremely precautious or minimally precautious. There is no clear definition of how precautious you should be when you apply any type of regulation. And that's a great problem for policy tool, and it can result in regulatory manipulation. It lacks comprehensiveness. There is no balance of benefits and risks, harms and benefits. They always look at the potential harms, even when they're purely theoretical. They never take into account the benefits. And frequently, they ask for inappropriate burden of proof. For example, for the last 10 years, we always ask that we don't know the long-term effects of these products. We don't know what's going to happen in 10 years. And after 10 years have passed, we don't know what's going to happen in 20 years. And in 20 years from now, we want to know what's going to happen in 30 years. Why? Because we are never able to know everything, which means that everything we do in science, not only in tobacco and tobacco harm reduction, in every field, it always includes some uncertainties. And that's why we never regulate and we never make decisions based on certainties. We make decisions based on current knowledge. And we are, of course, always open-minded and flexible to adjust based on new knowledge. But the burden of proof means that any kind of innovation, irrespective of the quality and the amount of evidence being available, it has such a huge burden of proof needed or asked for that it becomes basically criminalizing. They are criminalizing innovation, and that there should be a limit to that. Unfortunately, with the precautionary principle and the vaguely defined term, you cannot really have a limit on this burden of proof. And of course, it's asymmetrical because usually when you apply the precautionary principle, that's against any change. So you always try to maintain and support and protect the status quo. Unfortunately, for tobacco control, the status quo is smoking, because tobacco cigarettes have been the status quo for decades in society, not the other products. And of course, that stifles innovation and progress. And finally, it fails to accommodate trade-offs. It tends towards authoritarianism, which I also mentioned previously. And for harm reduction and tobacco control, the opinion is pretty obvious. Nothing is safe. That's the main slogan that we hear from many organizations. And we cannot accept even the minimum of harm, despite all our life being about addressing risks every day. I mean, I came here with my motorcycle and I was addressing the risks on the road. I just went from the opposite side of the street to the hotel side of the street, and I was managing the risks of being hit by a car. In everything we do daily, we are only managing risk. There is nothing in our lives which is risk-free. But in some cases, there are people who believe that we can only accept risk-free behaviors. And because of all the previous characteristics, it is again vulnerable to corruption. Because, you know, there are many ways to create predetermined decisions, and one of them is, of course, through corruption. As one said in a publication analyzing the precautionary principle, there is nothing wrong with it as long as we don't use it in decision making. And I think I wouldn't be so extreme that we should never be precautious, but we should put a limit to it. And I think that in many cases, particularly in tobacco harm reduction, they've gone way over the limit in their abuse of the precautionary principle. Now, the tobacco control tactics is mainly to use children, so to a slogan based on emotion. What is emotion? Emotion is a neural impulse that moves an organism to action, prompting automatic reactive behavior, not critical behavior. So emotions suppress critical thinking, and they create some sort of an instinctive behavior from people. It's all about the kids, you know. So it's so emotional that you don't even, you're not even going to look for evidence about the kids, let alone evidence about benefits for the others. You're just going to accept it because it's so emotional as an argument. And that, of course, creates an intergenerational discrimination, because I don't think that even if there was a huge problem with kids, that we should punish some adults in order to protect kids and not try to find a balance between the two. And of course, it shows total lack of solidarity and empathy for smokers. It has also lost focus. It's not about smoking. It's now not even about tobacco. It's about nicotine use. They target nicotine use, and at the same time, they stigmatize nicotine users, because this comes as automatically. And they show unprecedented closed-mindedness. Even during the COVID pandemic, instead of focusing on smoking-related health harms, they focus on nicotine use, which is a moral issue. It's not a public health issue. Maybe some philosophers may want to discuss about it, but it's not a public health issue at all. Now, all these characteristics and arguments, together with a strongly prohibitory agenda, they have transformed the science of tobacco control. It was supposed to be a scientific approach to the issue of smoking, into a form of a new atheistic religion that should be trusted blindly. So they are the owners, the only owners of the truth, and they cannot accept any deviation from that. So this is the definition of faith. It's not a definition of trust that I mentioned before. So these experts know better than anyone else, despite even not being experts in some fields. I've seen psychologists, even mechanical engineers, addressing toxicity issues, for example, in a scientific manner, while they have no background at all. They are the only owners of scientific truth, and also, however, not only that, even worse, the only owners of moral knowledge, the only owners of justice, and knowing and distinguishing between justice and injustice. They think that they only can do it themselves, and that they represent the sole defenders of human rights. They don't respect, however, individuality. They don't respect liberties and freedoms. They don't respect dignity. They don't respect autonomy. They don't respect personal preference, personal choices, and the right to make, of course, informed personal decisions. This is a form of scientism. And still, they use their assertions and their conclusions based on past experience with tobacco cigarettes. I mean, I don't need to explain how different harm reduction products are compared to tobacco cigarettes. That's a whole different discussion. But in reality, they fail to acknowledge the big difference that tobacco cigarettes did not have any public health benefits, but these products have a strong public health benefit because they are proposed and they are used as alternatives to smoking and not as a novel consumer product. And many seem to deny the provisional nature of scientific knowledge. So we don't know anything, and we will never be able to know anything, and knowledge changes. But I think it's far beyond that what's happening today with tobacco control. And as one of the best scientists in the world, the Nobelist Richard Feynman, he said science is the belief in the ignorance of the experts, and he was always looking for totality of evidence. He was always checking for totality of evidence. You cannot accept cherry picking and choosing evidence, data that support your own predetermined conclusion. And of course, he emphasized that uncertainty is central to scientific morality, and science is a form of constructive skepticism. But there are two types of skepticism. First of all, skepticism is very different from believing or disbelieving. With skepticism, you never have a yes or no as an answer. There are so many in-between answers, while with believe or disbelieve, you either believe that this is happening, yes or no. There are no intermediate answers. Now, with skepticism, we have microskepticism, which is questioning the soundness of every detail of fact, method, and logic, and this is mostly empirical. And we have macroskepticism, which is deductive, which relies on current scientific knowledge, but makes it backward-looking and destructively critical rather than constructively critical. So they're using examples, for example, examples from the past, and they apply them to the present and to the future. Now, there are several examples where this type of dogmatism in science has truly become a tyranny, and with people having knowledge monopolies and creating sort of research cartels. We have the same object, the same outcome that we're looking for, and we'll do our best to generate the outcome that we want for this particular research project. And it has become largely bureaucratic, And I think that tobacco control is one of these examples of macro skepticism. So usually we try to find the simplest answer, but the simplest answer in many cases is wrong. But the majority is following what is simpler as an answer. And this anti-harm reduction hysteria is becoming an impressive, intolerant, and authoritarian form of political correctness for smokers and for scientists who have different opinions than the established status quo. And that reminds me of the analysis by Max Weber of capitalism and the Protestantic ethics, that this tobacco control movement resembles a bureaucratic giant which concentrates large amounts of power in very few people, tends to generate a sort of a scientific oligarchy, and creates an inescapable fate of further bureaucratization and rationalization, in quotes, of course. So it's very simple to the iron cage that Max Weber was explaining in his books. And the future, and I'm going to end with that. Well, I think, and I'm going to use the Decalogue from Bertrand Russell, the famous philosopher. The 10 Commandments of Critical Thinking and Democratic Decency. The best answer to fanatism is liberalism. What does that mean? Do not feel absolutely certain of anything. That's what science is, basically. Do not think it worthwhile to proceed by concealing evidence, because the evidence will surely come to light at some point. Never try to discourage thinking, for you are sure to succeed. I mean, you can easily convince people, mainly emotionally, to stop being critical human beings and becoming instinctive human beings. When you meet with opposition, overcome it by argument and not by authority. You know, you're not right simply because you have the authority to implement your decisions and your opinions. You have to use arguments, evidence to support your opinion. A victory depending on authority is unreal, illusory, and will bound to fail. Have no respect for the authority of others, because you will always find some contrary authorities. Do not use power to suppress opinions you think pernicious, for if you do, the opinions will suppress eventually you. Do not fear to be eccentric in opinion, because every opinion accepted was once considered eccentric. You can find many examples in daily lives for that, in our daily lives for that. Find more pleasure in intelligent dissent than in passive agreement, for if you value intelligence, the former implies a deeper agreement than the latter. Be scrupulously truthful, even if the truth is inconvenient, because it is more inconvenient when you try to conceal the truth. And do not feel envious of the happiness of those who live in a fool's paradise, for only a fool will think that this is really happiness. So that's it. I think this is my best of the 10 commandments. Do not fear to be eccentric in opinion, for every opinion now accepted was once eccentric. I was in my early research career on e-cigarettes quite an eccentric guy, considering the environment in that field, and I'm happy that I'm not that eccentric today. But still, we are considered sort of eccentrics. Thank you very much.